Thank you for joining us for this edition of the interview on Africa 24. Dr. Kevin Kariuki, Vice President for Power, Energy, Climate and Green Growth of the African Development Bank Group, explains how the African Development Bank is supporting the continent's energy transition. Dr. Kevin Kariuki, it's a pleasure having you here on Africa 24 TV.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Where has most progress been made in Africa's power sector in recent years?
I think that question is multifaceted. First of all, it straddles the entire functional areas of the power sector, starting from generation, where we have been able to increase the proportion of renewable energy from 9% to over 87%. That's huge. And that has translated to about 3,300 megawatts of additional generation. At the same time, we have been able to develop about 7,000 or actually more than 7,000 kilometers of transmission lines and a lot of distribution lines. But what all this amounts to, what the key question that one would ask is, what impact have we had on increasing access to electricity? And what I would say is that over that period, we have been able to provide access to electricity to about 20 million people. And I'll give you an example just to show the significance of our interventions. If you look at a country like Kenya, for example, 10 years ago, when we embarked on what is called the last mile electrification project, Kenya's electrification rate was only 30%. Today, 10 years hence, the access rate has actually increased to over 75%. So I think that shows you the impact we've had on the continent, using Kenya as an example. Of course, there are many other countries that don't have the same level of access, and we are trying to also replicate the project that we had in Kenya into those countries.
Can you share with us your vision for promoting sustainable energy solutions in Africa, and how does it align with the overall goals of the African Development Bank?
The first thing is that when it comes to talking about sustainable energy, what I think people are alluding to is being able to produce energy in a sustainable manner. So the first thing that I can say is that in 2021, just prior to COP26, we made an addendum to the energy policy in which we precluded new investments in coal. So in other words, today, we cannot invest in new coal projects. That's number one. And number two, I've just spoken about, I've just told you that since 2016, we have increased our access to renewable energy to 87%. So that's a huge plus. But most importantly, also, when we instituted this addendum on coal, what we also promised is that we will be able to accompany countries in formulating just energy transition projects. So, of course, that is subject to countries asking for that kind of help. But I think the other thing that here, I would want to say is that it's one thing to say what our plans are, but I think what drives the point home is when we discuss about tangible projects. Here, we are in Morocco today, and I can cite what we call the Nur Wazizate concentrated solar power plant here in Morocco, in which the bank invested in. This is the largest concentrated solar power plant in the world. And we really are proud of the contribution that it is providing to the country. Of course, we have the Electrocana Wind project in Kenya, which is the largest privately financed, actually not just privately financed, is the largest wind farm project on the continent. So those are some of the huge projects that we are looking at. But of course, there are other projects that there are other very transformational projects that I can speak about. We can talk about the Ethiopia Djibouti transmission line. Huge impacts on both countries. On the one hand, you have Ethiopia being able to export part of its power, whereas Djibouti is able to replace its thermal power with hydro, and therefore reducing the cost of generation to the country and reducing tariffs. This is huge impact on Djibouti's economy.
Talking about your investment, the African Development Bank has an active portfolio of energy projects totaling over $12 billion.
That's correct.
And the bank is a key stakeholder and influencer in supporting access to clean and affordable energy across the African continent. According to you, what needs to be done to attract more investment in power projects?
No, I think the question that you ask is quite a pertinent one. Number one, because we were looking at statistics in the recent past. And again, I'll focus on renewable energy because that is what we are focusing on right now. If you look at the last 2 decades, Africa has only attracted 2% of global renewable energy investments. This is very small. Number one, considering the population that we have on the continent. And number two, considering that Africa has abundant sources of renewable energy. So, number one, the way we are looking at it is that we are saying we have all these renewable energy sources, potential renewable energy sources, which we must harness for purposes of being able to produce energy for the continent. And to do this, there are certain things that are important. Number one, we must create the right enabling environment to be able to attract private investments. I always like to cite something that I'm very close to because I'm an engineer. I always say that Ohm's law says that current follows the path of least resistance. But I also say, in the same way, capital also follows the path of least resistance. So what that means is that countries must ensure that they are able to improve the investment environment that exists in their countries, be it addressing regulatory environment, addressing legal and regulatory framework, addressing fiscal framework, just to be able to ensure that and the regulatory environment. And in so doing, what it does is that it ensures that investors will look at Africa or any country in Africa and make an assessment about how the quality of or how attractive that jurisdiction is to foreign investment, and capital will follow. So one of the things that I want to highlight is one thing we call the Electricity Regulatory Index. This is a tool that, or an index actually, an index that we established in 2018. And the idea of this index is to compare the regulatory regimes within our countries and compare it with international best practice. Because we do believe that from an investor perspective, when they look at a country, the first thing is that they look at is the regulatory environment. And if they don't feel that the regulatory environment is conducive to investment in their investment, then they don't come in. And so far, I'm very proud to say that we have already covered, since 2018, 45 out of the 54 countries on the continent. So we do believe that we are making the right measures, or we are making the right changes that will improve the investment environment on the continent. But beyond that, we also come up with, for example, what we call the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa. And what CEFA does is to crowd in private sector investment by de-risking investments. So that's one thing that we are very proud about, because we do believe that our interventions actually do attract investments, help in attracting investments. And lastly, just to mention that at COP27, we launched what we call the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. And the idea here is, again, to address some of the challenges that we have in attracting investment. And here, what I'm talking about is the bankability of projects. It's one thing to say, look, we have all these projects here. But what I can tell you is that unless projects are well structured and these projects are deemed bankable by the investment community, they will not come. So one of the roles that AGIA will play is in project preparation and addressing the bankability of projects so that with the $500 million that we're looking forward to raising for project preparation and project development, we can be able to mobilize an additional $10 billion of investments.
Let's talk about hydropower. What is the Africa Development Bank's view on the potential of large-scale hydropower?
Now, I think one of the things that, and you've asked me, you've asked a question that I love. And I say I love the question is because um, in my previous life, I developed the largest privately financed hydropower project on the continent, the Bujagali hydropower project in Uganda. At that time, everybody thought we were crazy investing up to $1 billion in a hydropower plant, 250 megawatts in Uganda. But what I can tell you is that Africa has huge hydro potential. I think of the very high quality hydro potential that we have, today we can say that we have about 350 gigawatts, or rather 350,000 megawatts of hydropower potential, starting from smallish hydro projects to large hydro projects such as Inga. And I do believe that the beauty with hydropower is that it provides a source of baseload. Of course, there are concerns about the changing hydrology because of changes in climate change. But I think by and large, hydro will remain to be a significant contributor to the energy mixes on the continent. I mean, for example, in Cameroon, we are doing the Nachtigal hydropower project. That's 420 megawatts. That's the next largest hydropower project after Bujagali. And then we have Mpandankua, I think that which was featured in one of the boardrooms here at AIF 2023. And this project is, what they are doing is that they are giving me more and more confidence that we can be able to do larger and more transformative projects, because I've talked about Bujagali, it was 1 billion. Everybody thought it was crazy. Then Nachtigal came 420 megawatts, about maybe 2 billion. Now we have Pandankua at almost 5 billion. So in my view, what this means is that sooner rather than later, we will be able to attract sufficient financing to develop the great Inga, the Grand Inga hydropower project. So if, in a nutshell, I do believe there's tremendous hope for exploiting hydropower potential for purposes of power production on the continent using hydropower. And by the way, I mean, of the capacity that I spoke about, we have only harnessed 7%. So there's a lot of potential of hydro that remains unexploited. Again, in Cameroon, you have the Kikot hydropower that will be 500 megawatts that is being considered for development. Let me stop there.
The African Development Bank's ambition is to help double industrial GDP by 2025. So what place do renewable energies occupy in this perspective?
The way I would look at that question is that we know it's a fact that energy is the engine for growth. And the beauty with energy is that there is a very close correlation between GDP growth and energy growth. So in actual fact, the correlation is so strong that if I saw the GDP of a country, I can almost allude to the fact that if it's X, I can say the growth in energy is also X. Similarly, if I went to a country and I saw that the growth in energy demand is Y, invariably, the growth in GDP will be very close to Y. There's that close correlation. So the way we view ourselves is that by providing interventions that assist in the development of power, we will be contributing towards the doubling of the GDP that you spoke about. And I've just told you, Africa has tremendous sources of energy, starting from even fossil fuels, gas, coal, oil. Those are fuels. But what needs to be done is that we need to optimize both all our sources of energy to be able to get the right energy mix that is able to grow our demand fast enough. So, for example, you asked me about hydro. I can talk about geothermal. But what you need to know is that in order for you to be able to grow your demand, you need to project the demand that is required and be able to say, based on based on this demand, I need to be growing my base load by so much. But when you talk about base load, you'll probably be looking at geothermal. You'll probably be looking at hydro, because those are the ones that provide the base load. Then you'll go to what we call mid-merit. In mid-merit, then you'll be probably looking at about maybe gas or even maybe wind or those kind of things. And then you go to picking. So that's the way it works. So all I can say is that Africa is well endowed with vast sources of renewable energy, which I do believe can be able to underpin the double GDP growth that you're talking about by 2025. You said 2025? Yes. I do believe that we can be able to achieve that.
Talking about long-term progress, are you optimistic that Africa will realize the UN SDG goal for energy access for all by 2030?
All I can say is that based on the last report, we are off track as far as meeting the SDG number 7, that is energy for all, by 2030. We are off track. However, I am confident that if we put our efforts together and be able to, for example, be able to connect 90 million people every year to electricity, we will be able to meet that SDG goal. The same will apply to when it comes to access to clean cooking, because we have about 1 billion people who don't have access to clean cooking. Again, if we do 130 million people every year, if we provided access to clean cooking to about 130 million people every year, we would be able to achieve that by 2030. But what that means is that we must be able to deploy resources at a massive scale. There are no two ways about it. This requires significant amounts of money. For example, I think the International Energy Agency sort of projects that in order for us to be able to meet the SDGs number 7 goal by 2030, we need to be investing about $25 billion every year to projects that will contribute towards energy access. And to be able to meet the clean cooking, access to clean cooking, universal clean cooking by 2030, we will need about, I said 130. But what that means, the amount of money that is required is actually much less. You only need about $4 billion a year to be able to achieve. So I do believe that if we are able to attract significant resources, yes, we can be able to achieve those universal access to energy by 2030.
Dr. Kevin Kariuki, Vice President for Power, Energy, Climate and Green Growth of the African Development Bank Group. It was a pleasure having you with us on Africa 24.
Thank you very much. It was truly a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
And that was it for this interview. Stay tuned for more programs on Africa 24.